Hello, internets. I'm Brett. I'm here tonight in my area, at least it's tonight, for another weekly edition of Docker Ask Me Anything. It's really everything about containers, orchestration, container tools like Docker and Kubernetes and Swarm. And basically, I take your questions. So if you haven't been here before, the way this works is I spend about the first 15 minutes or so sort of talking about some new things, sort of latest news of what I've been working on and things happening in sort of my part of the container ecosystem, because obviously we could spend hours every week talking about the sheer number of new things every week in containers. So we're going to talk a little bit about Docker's upcoming beta, Hacktoberfest, which you probably see in the background, and some other stuff that I've noticed in the last week or two that's pretty interesting to check out. And then I'm going to take your questions. So now is the time to get into chat, ask your questions. If you've got any projects you're working on and there's specific issues with containers that you have concerns or issues or questions about, hopefully I can help steer you in the right direction, and we'll do that live, and we'll try to get everybody's questions answered as quickly as possible. So I go from the top down in chat, and I start from the beginning. And if you get in at the last minute, all the way at the end of this hour, then I'll still try to answer your questions after we go off air in the chat. So even if you don't get your question answered live, I will stay around and chat for a while inside of the YouTube chat. So all of these episodes, thanks to Josh. Hello, Josh. He convinced me to put these episodes now on YouTube forever. So there's now a playlist in my channel known as Docker AMA, so you can see past episodes, and they're there for good and bad, all the mistakes, all of the awesome advice that I might give, and all the horrible advice that I might give. So that's all there in permanently on YouTube, and we'll see how that works out. So for those of you that have been asking for episodes that you missed, those are now there. You can check them out. They're actually ordered in decreasing so that you can watch last week's first, and then the week after that, and the week after that, going back in time, because obviously stuff from 3 months ago may not even be true now. So things move fast in containers, and so that's why we do this weekly. And if you don't know who we are, this is basically my live channel on YouTube, but it's also about my courses on Udemy, and you'll see in the description there's some links. We'll talk about that in a minute, about some of my resources you can get to. But I run a couple of courses on Udemy. We're actually working on a third and fourth course, and some other people are helping me with that. We actually have a growing team of people helping build out container-specific courses focused around Docker and soon Kubernetes. That will happen later this year or early 2019, and away we go. So the first thing I want to talk about is Hacktoberfest, the thing behind me, because that you only have like 8 or 9 days left before that is over. And the way this works is you actually go over here to the Hacktoberfest website. So that's hacktoberfestdigitalocean.com. I'm going to throw that into the chat. And all you have to do is sign up there basically so that they can watch your GitHub. And then you do 5 pull requests on some open source. It can be your own open source. It could be my open source. It could be really any open source that's on GitHub. If you do 5 legitimate pull requests to help out the community of open source, and you do that by October 31st, by the end of the day in your time zone, then they will actually count that, and they will send you a shirt. As long as you're one of the first, I think it's 50,000 people get a shirt this year. So check that out if you've not done Hacktoberfest before. It's a great way to get involved. One of the things you can do is, if you're on GitHub, you can actually do a search for any issue in any repo that has the word Hacktoberfest in it. So, for instance, on some of the ones that I have on my open source that is in support of my courses and also container tools that I create for the community, I put the word Hacktoberfest on anything related to issues or pull requests that people might be able to help out with that maybe aren't super advanced, or some of them are even just documentation, really, not even any code in there. So if you're looking to get your t-shirt and just to help out the community and get started with open source, that's a great way. If you're already fully involved with helping out open source, you probably will already have 5 pull requests this month. So thank you for your time and help in the community. The next thing up on the list is Docker was named in a report a couple of weeks ago from one of the industry analysts out there, Forrester, and they did name Docker as well as Red Hat and Rancher, interestingly enough, in the enterprise container space. So what does that really mean, enterprise container space? The problem nowadays is that there are so many tools that we all need to just really run containers that we're really not talking in this report about the runtime or that low-level utility that we all think of when we type in Docker run. Those are one piece of the large set of tools you now need in order to truly have a enterprise solution. So the industry now has sort of agreed around the fact that you need an orchestrator like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or Mesos or something. And then you need networking layer topologies that organize your networking and help with service discovery and DNS. And then you probably need some sort of GUI web management on top of that. So that's maybe up here if there's like a stack of tools. You got like networking and runtime, and then you have orchestrator, and then you have a UI. And then you probably need some sort of role-based authentication solutions. So you got role-based access control as well as authentication tied in. And so when you start talking about all those together, there's not a lot of companies out there that have the entire product suite. So Forrester went through and they actually looked at, I don't know what it was here, like 7 or 8 in this graphic. So I'm going to put this link in chat in case you're interested in downloading the summary of the report. It gives you a nice, I think it's like a 10-page PDF for free. And you can check that out in case you're looking for a business high-end, usually paid product. Usually most of these assume if you're truly doing enterprise computing, you're going to want to pay for your products. And so really the leaders in there were Docker at the very top, Red Hat with I think the size of that bubble there has to do with their amount of customers they have, and Red Hat OpenShift is what they're talking about there. And then the Rancher Labs Rancher solution, which those three I think are the ones that I've been recommending for a while, depending on which camp you're in. If you are definitely in the Red Hat camp, if you're running Red Hat Enterprise Linux, you're probably going to do OpenShift. That just makes sense because that's a part of the offering that you get with licensing those servers and all that. So you get support through them. In fact, Red Hat recently announced that they will not support Docker additions from Docker or even Docker Swarm. I think they're not sure. I think they actually had some opinions around upstream Kubernetes. I think there was a big announcement, if you kind of search around, that Red Hat sort of changed their structure to basically force you, if you're on Red Hat, into their OpenShift offering, which frankly makes sense because that's where they're putting all their people and their effort and time into that product. So yes, you should probably do that if you're paying for Red Hat. They clarified that they're not going to support every possible scenario from other people's products. That kind of makes sense. Also, if you're on Docker, if you're doing Docker Enterprise has their own official best practices for what they will support. And recently that came up in chat with me on my courses. Several people asking about Docker Enterprise and kernels it supports and different sort of distributions of Linux and Linux tools that Docker will support. So you definitely want to check that out. If you're interested in the Docker Enterprise tooling, you would want to head over to success.docker.com. That is sort of like if you've ever done anything Microsoft, you know they have like Microsoft Knowledge Base, TechNet, and this is sort of like Docker's version of TechNet, right? So they have all their enterprise solutions, including best practices, as well as build-out guides, and even downloadable tooling around how to automate deployments through things like Ansible and Terraform. Those are all there. So anyway, that report's out. You can check that out. There's lots of other reports out there. Obviously, there's big names like Gartner that has their own report, their Magic Quadrant that they do. And this is sort of Forrester's. I thought that this was a pretty interesting one, although it didn't actually, what was interesting, it didn't really talk about or mention one of the Kubernetes. There's several companies out there that are making sort of Kubernetes upstream solutions that are sort of pure open source. So they didn't get mentioned in here. This was, I think, more of the traditional productized software plus solution stuff. So not everything in the marketplace is in here, but these are some of the big players. Interesting to look at. All right, next thing up. Before we get to the questions, let's talk about the upcoming Docker 1809 beta. So Docker has been testing this now semi-annual release because if you're paying attention, you saw that earlier this year they announced they're only going to be releasing official stable versions of Docker once every 6 months now. So they're slowing down, getting more stable as they grow. And one of those things is that the first release is going to be 1809. So that's going to drop any day now. In fact, we can kind of go over to GitHub and check on that. Let's see. I think it's Docker, Docker CE. So you would think you'd go to Moby/Moby, but that's where the open source stuff is. If you want to learn about when they're releasing their commercial releases, even their community releases, you would go here. So they just released beta 3, it looks like, 17 days ago. So we're kind of expecting here this month, hopefully, is when they're supposed to release the 1809, but I know that they will delay that if they have to make sure that everything's super stable. So 1809 is coming, and there's a changelog here. Now, we're not going to go through this whole changelog because I would probably want to make a whole separate video on all the changes that are coming. One of those big ones is around the builder, and you'll see there's lots of stuff in here mentioned at the top around BuildKit. BuildKit is a brand new way to build Docker images. It's faster, it's more efficient, it's going to have a lot more features to it. It's not going to be the default out of the box because it potentially could have breaking changes. So they're going to leave the old builder that we've all known for 5 years now in there as the default for the foreseeable future, and this new one known as BuildKit. So if you just Google around, you'll find a lot of information around people talking about BuildKit. That's BuildKit. And so BuildKit is its own repo, and it's its own technology that's open source that they're building into the new Docker versions for making images, and there's a lot of new slickness to it. One of my specific excited geek features around it that's really kind of nerdy is that how it will be smart enough to now do things simultaneously in an asynchronous format. So it figures out, based on your Docker file, what needs to depend on other parts of your Docker file. And if it figures out there's no dependency there, it will run things in simultaneous threads, which is really going to make things a lot faster when you're building long Docker builds, especially when you have to depend on like apt-gets or any package managers. It can do some of those things simultaneously. The thing I want to talk about today and show you a quick demo of is the SSH access that we have now with Docker. So in 1809, in the beta today, if you were to get the beta or even the Edge release on Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, which comes now, the Edge releases of those come with the beta version 1809. You have this new feature where you can use the Docker CLI on your machine to have to get to a remote Docker server without needing to set up certificate-based authentication on the TCP endpoint of the Docker engine. So if you've ever looked into this, if you've ever had a production cluster, you know that it's a little bit tedious to set up certificates on a remote server, especially if you're in a team, because now you want to have different certificates for every person so that you can, deny someone access when they leave the team. And that requires usually some higher level tool like Docker Enterprise or Rancher or something like that. So in fact, Docker Enterprise actually solves this by connecting you to LDAP, and you can do Active Directory authentication and all that. But out of the box with the free versions, we don't get any of this. You can use Portainer, which is a GUI solution to solve some of these problems. So in case you're not familiar with Portainer, it can sit on top of Docker or Swarm and help also with its own authentication built in out of the box. So it provides some of that. But if you just want remote CLI, you typically had to either give everybody SSH access or come up with a certificate solution. Now, let me jump back over here. So Luke, one of the Docker captains in Europe, has actually got a great walkthrough of how this SSH feature works, and he put it on Medium this week. And it's super easy to get started. So let me just show you. I have a vanilla server on, it looks like it's not finished. Let me refresh. So in my DigitalOcean, I created a droplet, and it's a brand new server. And so I'm going to jump into that server real quick. And while we're talking, I'm going to have it install Docker in the background. And then we're going to connect later when we're halfway through our questions or whatever. So let me just SSH into that. And I'm using my own certificate key. Oh. Security. So now I'm on this server. There's nothing on it. So I'm just going to jump over and do a quick test install. Now remember, you have to use the test version of Docker right now because this is not a released feature. So I'm going to download the test script and install Docker real quick. And that's why I have to install Docker manually. I can't use the the current stable version will not work. I have to use the beta version. Okay, so this is going to run the background and get me the latest beta of 1809, and we'll come back here in a few minutes, hopefully when that's done. Yeah, okay. All right, so while we're waiting on that to install, let's jump over to the questions and see who's got some questions in GitHub and who we can say hi to. All right, so we got Kevin in the channel. Kevin is a longtime friend of mine. Hello, he's chatting from Chesapeake. Thanks for coming. Josh, hello, Josh. Always on the call. Nice to have you this evening. It's nice to have an evening call, right? So we don't have to interrupt our workday here in the States. Victor, hello. Purdhavi, I believe that's how you pronounce your name. Hello, nice to see you. Carlos, hello. Paolo, is there any plan for Docker CE on OpenSUSE or SUSE 15? So more OpenSUSE and SUSE in Europe than USA. Yes. So here's Docker's official stance on SUSE or on Red Hat Enterprise Linux or any paid version of Linux. Docker's opinion is if you are using a paid version or any OS that is a private paid version of an OS, that you should pay for Docker as well. So their approach to it is that the community editions of Docker are freely available for free OSs or for developers developing on Mac and Windows. So they do provide the Docker CE, Docker for Desktop, free to Mac and Windows developers. On pure Linux OSs, they do not provide out of the box free community edition versions for Linux distributions that are paid. That was their decision. Now, you can probably get it working depending on the package manager, right? So if you're on a Yum package manager, you might be able to find the directions for an open source Yum version like CentOS, right? So for a lot of the Red Hat people, they ask, how do I get Docker CE on Red Hat Enterprise Linux on my local developer machine? And the answer there is to go look at the CentOS instructions because that is an open source equivalent and uses the same package manager, so you should be able to use the same packages. The same is true on the Debian side. So if you're using anything with an apt package manager that's a paid version of the OS, Docker is going to expect you to use a paid version of Docker, but you probably can get the free version to work through the store. So the answer is, you go to the store and you'll see how if you click under Docker EE, you will see EE versions for various paid versions of Linux, like Oracle, the IBM mainframes, stuff like that. SUSE has an edition there. So the question you got to ask yourself is, what package manager does SUSE use? And when you want to go get your own packages for SUSE, where can you find those, in that package format? I have never run it, so I'm not going to be the right person to tell you exactly where to go find the best one there. Yeah. Yep. So that's exactly it. Yeah, I think you're saying in there, CentOS, if you can use the CentOS packages because they're the same package manager format, then that's where you would need to do. I'm sure someone has instructions online on how to do it. It's just Docker's not, unless they change their whole company stance on it, they're not going to provide easy one-line installs for paid versions of Linux for free. You would have to buy the Docker Enterprise license for that. So if you can get some other copy somewhere to actually work, then that's up to you, and it should work. Because inherently at the low level, as long as the kernel has the same functionality that's required out of the box for Docker to run, it technically should run, right? It's just a matter of getting the package manager to get all that stuff working on your machine. All right, hope that helps. Hopefully that gets you what you need to do. While we're sitting here, let's jump back over to my little test. And okay, so we are now on this system, and I should have Docker running. Yes. Oh, it looks like I'm not. I'm on 1806. Bummer. I thought I did a test install. Oh, I need to do a test build. All right, hold on one second. Oops. remove. All right, so I need to uninstall the version that I didn't want. I need to get the test script. Pam says, thanks. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Thanks for the awesome courses on Udemy and this live AMA. You are most welcome, and thanks for buying the courses. All right, so we are going to SSH test. See if we can get that to work. And you're asking me, when I try to use image for my private registry in Docker Compose, that doesn't pull automatically, and I must pull manually before Docker Composer up or Docker Stack deploy. If that's a question, you are correct. Yes, that Docker Compose won't always check for the latest version of your images unless you either specify the exact version, and that's why you probably shouldn't reuse tags all the time inside your Docker Compose file, or when you do a Docker Compose, look at the help. So Docker Compose up. Let's see. You can force it to try to rebuild your image. If your image is locally and you need to rebuild it, you can do a -- build. If you need it, if the image has changed somewhere else and you need to pull the new copy of the image, and you already have, basically Docker Compose will not check, I don't believe it will check, with the registry to match that you have the latest copy of your tag. So if you're reusing tags over and over, then Docker doesn't always have an easy way to tell what you mean when you say latest in your Docker Compose file with the reusing of the tag over and over again on the internet. So generally the workflow is, if you're developing locally, you are having Docker Compose build your images and not changing the image up on the internet and constantly downloading it. So if you need to do a Docker Compose pull, you can do that, and that will check all the images on your registry and pull those, if that's what you're looking to do. But I do not believe out of the box, unless somebody can find it for me, I don't believe out of the box you can force it on every Docker Compose up to always check for the latest images on the internet. The challenge for me is that Docker Run, and for all of us, Docker Run, Docker Compose, and Docker Swarm stacks all have different ways they deal with image tags and whether they go and check for the latest reuse of that latest tag, which is why I constantly am reminding people that if you're talking about your production workflows and your CI workflows, then you shouldn't be reusing tags, because you cannot predict exactly how every tool is going to act against that image tag if you're reusing it over and over again. Swarm does it a little bit different, and if you're only doing that for Swarm and you can force it, then by knowing exactly how Swarm is going to treat it, and Swarm has changed the way it treats it over the last year or two. So basically, my attitude toward it is that you shouldn't be reusing tags when you're talking about remote CIs and remote registries. For your local machine and local development, usually you're building those container images on top of something else. So whenever I need to rebuild locally, I'm always doing a Docker Compose up -- build, and that forces it to make sure that my build is the freshest, latest locally. Hopefully that helps you. If not, please feel free to ask more questions in the chat, and I will get to those when we get to those. All right. So what I have here, back to my example, let's see, Docker version. Oh, right, now we're on the beta. I got the right version. So what I have here is I have a test server on the internet, and it is not listening on TCP. So the Docker daemon is not exposed to the internet yet. And so I'm going to exit out of that machine, and now I'm on my local machine. If I want to do Docker commands, now notice the beta's here, right? So this is me on the server. Notice little things like it's using the Linux version of the command line, and it's using the Linux version of the host. And then if I do a Docker version now, I should see the versions on my local machine. Oops. Okay. And let's see, those are exact. Those are the same value. So these are beta 1. So my local machine only has beta 1. And if you saw a while ago, the remote server, let me zoom in a little bit. The remote server has beta 3. So that's how we're going to be able to tell the difference between my local CLI and the remote server. So a new feature in 1809 is that all I have to do is set my Docker host. I can do it one of two ways. But the way I like to do it is if I export Docker host, and then I have this new ability where I can say SSH and then root and the IP address of my server. And let's go get that because I have this DigitalOcean machine. And if I copy that IP in, what I'm doing here is I'm telling the Docker CLI that I want when it does commands, it will talk against this remote server securely over SSH. And since I already can connect to the server over SSH, I can now use that as a tunnel or a proxy into the Docker daemon on that remote host. So as soon as I do this, I should be able to do a Docker version. And when I get this back, you'll notice that my client is the local client running beta 1, but now the server I'm talking to is beta 3. Pretty cool, right? So now if I had a bunch of servers, instead of having to create a certificate infrastructure where I have to manage who has access to those certificates, I just have to make sure that whoever needs access has SSH access and is in a group that has permissions to control Docker. And then once I do that, instead of them SSHing into the remote server and then having to figure out, okay, now that I'm here, how do I download my compose files and my stack files and all my stuff, right? You don't have to do that anymore. So now I could just jump into something like over here in my workshop, I could jump into a stacks directory, and I have something in here. I have a compose, just for example, let me just show you this Docker coins YAML file. So this Docker coins YAML file builds a bunch of code, and it pulls down a bunch of images and stuff like that. So I could probably do this. This may not work, but we'll see. Docker compose up. Oh, that's right. I have to specify the file. Docker coins YAML up. Okay, so this is a good point. I forgot about this. Docker compose doesn't yet have this feature. So I can't use this, unfortunately, with the Docker compose command line, but what I can do is stuff like this. So I can say Docker swarm init. And remember, I'm talking against my remote server. So it's telling me I need to specify an address. So now I can enable Docker swarm on my remote host. Let me just do that. And now if I'm looking at a stack file, I can deploy Docker stack deploy visualizer. I'm just going to call it viz. So this is me deploying on the remote server a swarm stack right after enabling swarm. And so I should be able to go to that IP address now in my browser. And I think it's on port 8000. Let me do a check real quick. Oh, 8080. So I should be able to go to 8080, and if you were live, you could go check this too. We'll see if it's downloaded the images yet. Still got to download the images. Oh, looks like it's downloaded. All right, let's do it. There we go. So in case you were just wanting to see if this is real, I'm going to throw that in the chat, and you can actually hit that from your site and see that indeed I set up a server on the internet. I was able to remotely control it from my machine, and I was able to deploy a stack file from my machine to that remote host without ever copying any files over. Because ideally in Docker and in Swarm, you want your servers to have nothing but Docker on them. You don't want to have to put a bunch of other files on the host. You really want to manage everything inside containers and inside volumes. One of the ways you do that is by running Docker CLI on your local machine against remote servers. that was always challenging in the past if you were using the free community edition because it didn't have this stuff built in. Now with 1809, we can do this without having to SSH remotely and without having to set up the TLS certification certificates that you would have to deal with in that case. So pretty cool, right? I'm looking forward to that, and I'm going to be putting that in some new videos for my new course, Docker for Node.js, which is my next course being released here in the next few months. Now, in case you were curious about any of those courses, Docker, you can just go to brettfisher.com/Docker, and that's going to have a list of not just my courses and also the best coupons, but also all my other free resources like my tools that I work on that are open source for testing and controlling Docker, and other stuff like my live workshops in case you're going to a conference somewhere that I might be there. So anyway, check that stuff out if you haven't seen it before. Let's get back to the questions. All right. Paulo says hi from Toronto. Hello. Alfonso from Orlando. That's not far away. East Coast, US. Back to some questions. Many examples for CentOS, but not OpenSUSE. Yes, I tried, but oh man, it's not as easy as CentOS. Yeah, and that's the problem. If you're using paid versions, yeah, unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with that. Yeah, package manager, Zyper. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it. Zyper? Tony asks, hi, I am trying to set a GitLab self-hosted repository. When I execute Docker Compose up using the GitLab default image, the container looks like it is okay. I can't complete the message. Tony, I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm trying to set a GitLab self-hosted repository. When I execute Docker Compose up using the GitLab default image, the container looks like it is okay. So, Tony, I'd say maybe give me more examples. Oh, okay. Yeah, give me more details, and maybe I can help you with Docker Compose up. Now, remember, if you're using Docker Compose up with a registry that's not Docker Hub, or it's anything, if it's a private repo, you have to make sure that you authenticate with Docker login before you can use Docker Compose up, right? Because Docker Compose up cannot hold those registry logins inside the Compose file. It has to be a Docker login command. But feel free to keep asking your questions, and I will get back to them. All right. Hello, thanks for your updated Swarm course on Udemy. You are most welcome. If that's not a question, but thanks. You're most welcome. I'm glad you're taking the Swarm course. There's more stuff for the Swarm course coming, and unfortunately right now I'm finishing up the Docker for Node course, and then hopefully we can get some more stuff into Swarm. But as always, you have access inside these courses. You have access to the Docker Mastery chat. You can ask in there. You can ask any questions here on anything Swarm related. But yeah, there's definitely more content coming for that course. Tony says, continuing. All right. I'll wait anxiously for your questions. So I've all caught up with the queue and the chat. So if you have any questions, now is your time to throw them in there. If not, I will keep talking about other things that I'm working on. So besides these Docker resources here, and again, some of these down here in my popular how-tos and sample projects and tools, a lot of these things are also available for your help in the Hacktoberfest. So down here I have something under Node.js for the Docker good defaults in case you're a Node.js person. This is a project that is becomes kind of quite popular. Actually, I think it's my most stars on, or one of my most starred GitHub repos. So I'm excited that the community has actually rallied around it, and we have some good pull requests actually from the Hacktoberfest going on right now with people adding some features to this. And the whole goal here is to create a sample project for someone getting started in Docker if they're already a Node developer. So if you've learned Node, you know Node, but you need to get it working in Docker, and maybe you've gone through maybe my Docker Mastery course, but you're looking for more specifics on exactly how the best way it is to run Node locally on your machine as well as in production. That's what this little project is about here, and that's the focus of my next Docker course, which is taking this project sample file and expanding it to a multi-hour course talking about all the ins and outs of Node for local development, how to make it as fast as possible, how to do it in CI and your testing infrastructure, and then also how to get it into production and then update it on the fly without hurting downtime for your users. So that's all going to be in that course, and we're working on that now, so that's going to be pretty exciting. The next little project I thought I'd mention is the PHP project for PHP and Laravel. If you're at all in those communities, luckily over the last few years, that community, especially with Laravel, has got some great examples on how to use Docker. I have taken the approach with this project of taking real world deployments of PHP and giving examples. Unfortunately, right now, it is not complete. It's still a work in progress, so I could totally use some help from people that have done PHP in production and know some of the struggles with getting everything working correctly in Docker. And I have just not had enough time to donate to this open source community project here. So if you are in that world and you're working on PHP, I would love some help with that. It's a project that will basically help you set up your base layers and your base image that you can then build your PHP projects on top of, as well as learning things about permissions and PHP directories that sometimes get more complicated when you're doing PHP development with Docker. Something else I want to mention is my dog versus cat repo. So this is a repo that I started about 6 months ago. And if you are all interested in Swarm, this is a great project for showing you how you're going to start building up what I call your layers of stacks or your tech stack inside of your orchestrator. And so you usually need to start out with your networking and your storage, and then you worry about proxying and monitoring and logging, and then you start to build in your apps, and then maybe you want a management website GUI on top of that to manage your infrastructure. And so this project, which I talked about on stage at DockerCon this year, has turned into a side project where other people are helping out, and we're sort of building out the stack infrastructure here to give a good example of how you might deploy many different applications all in the same swarm with things like, let's encrypt automatic SSL and front-end proxy load balancing and automatic rolling updates so that when you do updates, if they fail, it automatically rolls back, and managing your logging and your monitoring. A lot of that stuff that you have to care about when you go production. So check out the dog versus cat. You can actually get that over at http://dogversus.cat. So that's a fun project that I want to let you know about. That's also going to be expanded upon inside my Swarm Mastery course when I get some time to do that. All right, so I'm back to the questions, and we'll see if anybody has added some new questions to the chat. All right, Victor's back. Hello. If I have a swarm with a manager drain, so only workers can execute services and my services are defined global, is it possible to change the networking driver to isolate services on each host? Is it possible to change the networking driver to isolate services on each host? I'm not sure, Victor, what you mean by changing out the networking driver. So you can't change the networking driver of an overlay network. The overlay network is the driver, right? So if you wanted to use something else like Mac VLAN or a bridge network driver or the host network driver, you would have to create a new network for that and then assign that network to your services. So I'm not sure what your question is. Maybe you can ask it a different way, maybe, Victor, and that way I can understand more what you're asking. So when it comes to Swarm and the Swarm managers, I don't normally advise draining, because draining means that you can't run any containers on that host, not even monitoring tools. And so typically in real-world scenarios, you're going to need to run something on your managers. It might be a logging tool. It might be a monitoring container. It might just be some utilities for troubleshooting or something. And so what I typically advise is that people use Swarm constraints and node labels to manage where their stuff goes inside the Swarm. So if you have managers and workers, in fact, in my dog versus cat repo project, you can actually see that Let me see if I... of course. Doesn't ever find anything. So somewhere in here, like let's say... So here's a good example. Let me zoom in here. So in this case, this particular container has a placement constraint that will only allow it to run on a manager. And you could flip that around and say equal equal worker, and it would only run on a worker. You could also give every one of your nodes a label just through the docker nodes command. So if you're on here, you could just do docker node, and you'll see that one of the options is update. And one of these is label add, label remove. So you can add metadata labels to any of the nodes in your swarm. And then once you've done that, you can then use that placement constraint, just like here, to make any arbitrary labels that you want. And then that's how you control your work. I don't typically advise using the drain method of controlling work because it's kind of brute force. It doesn't, like I said before, it doesn't allow you to run anything. So it's kind of tough unless you do a Docker run. And I don't like to use Docker runs because then my swarm isn't controlling the container. So anyway, yeah, constraints sounds good. Okay, cool. Glad you like that, Victor, because I think that's a much more flexible design. The one negative is if you forget to do constraints every single time for every container, then you might accidentally get work that will run on your managers because you forgot them. So I'll just say that maybe make a template for your stack files, and that template is always going to have a constraint stuff in it. Like whenever I make templates, I always make sure that down here I have my logging and my resource limits. That way, there's sort of that minimum stuff that always goes in each service every time. And that way I don't accidentally deploy something that goes where it shouldn't. So try that. Oh, Josh, hello. Since switching to Docker Swarm, I have not touched Docker Compose. Is there any reason people should still be using Docker Compose other than inertia? That's a good question. Well, so let me think. I would say, are you asking, Josh, about production? Because Docker Compose is still the primo tool to use locally on your machine. If you're a developer or a tester, when you're doing stuff locally, I always use Docker Compose. I never use Docker run commands because they're very tedious. I don't make shell scripts to run Docker run commands because that's the purpose of Docker Compose, so that I don't have to create shell scripts. So if you're talking about on servers, correct. I don't see, there's very, very few edge cases that I see a need for running Docker Compose. The only reason I would do it in production is if I only needed one server and I needed to do something that was not supported inside of Docker Swarm. So maybe I needed something that was using GPUs or had the hardware device support, and I needed to do it on a server. Docker Compose might support that, whereas Swarm wouldn't, because there are still some cases on Swarm. You can see that in my my AMA. I think it's issue 8 that I've referenced so much. I actually list out all the reasons why you would want to use Swarm rather than Compose. I don't necessarily in here, though, have a list of edge cases for when you would use Compose. Bottom line, if I'm on a server, if that server is not my machine and that's somewhere else, any machine I'm running, I'm going to look to use Swarm even if it's a single node every single time. And I'll only avoid Swarm and do something else like either Kubernetes or just straight up Docker Run or Docker Compose. I'll only look to those tools if Swarm can't get the job done, just simply due to the fact that Swarm is so easy and it just works everywhere. So but it doesn't solve every problem for everyone. So it's hard to name all those things off the top of my head, but usually people avoid Swarm when it's hardware device support that Swarm doesn't support, or it's some sort of syscall or low-level Linux configuration that Swarm won't support. And then lastly will be things like networking or features that simply Swarm doesn't have out of the box. And if you're curious about that list, there's actually it's mostly up to date. I wouldn't say that it's absolutely 100%. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, always looking for this issue. Oh, I know what it is. I put it somewhere else. There we go. It's an epic, an epic issue. So if you're curious, that Docker run. So this GitHub issue is a list. It's actually a chart of all the things that, and it actually doesn't work well when I zoom out. So each one of the issues is here in the middle. So for example, device C group rule. So it's not yet supported. That's what the question box is on the left. And I think the question means whether or not it's ever actually going to be supported. Yeah, he doesn't make any definition of what the question marks mean. I think the red X means it's not going to be supported ever. Yeah, it does not. This one does not apply to services as there are multiple containers backing it. So this one wouldn't ever apply. So basically every Docker run option here, and then, yeah, this thing is just, doesn't display well in here anymore. It's gotten so big, it probably needs to be a spreadsheet we track in GitHub or in Google Sheets or something. Anyway, in case you're curious, there's obviously a lot of green checkbox compared to 2 years ago because they've added a lot of stuff and fixed a lot of stuff. But you know, it's I don't know what 75, 100 things maybe on this list. So anyway, check that out. Mainly production, but I even use Swarm locally. Don't want to have to maintain separate Swarm and compose YAMLs. Interesting. So one of the things though is Swarm locally. Though, does Swarm locally work well for development? I would assume it would not work as well as Docker Compose because Docker Compose has a workflow around building and Swarm doesn't build. So whenever you're doing stuff like Docker Compose up -- build, in order to build images during a refresh while you're doing development, Swarm wouldn't be able to do that. So you'd have to do something else to build your images. Anyway, so that's where Docker Compose is focused on building and running locally in a Compose file, and then Swarm is focused only on deploying and running and not building. So I would say that I have not seen any teams that I work with using Swarm actually use Swarm locally for development. I would say that they stick with Compose and leave Swarm to the DevOps teams that need to do that stuff. So typically when a team gets complicated enough, they end up having to split out their Compose files into, even though they're all compatible, you can totally make one single file that's compatible with both. But typically the needs are different. For example, a lot of teams will use databases hosted in the cloud, and so their local Docker Compose files will have data like MySQL in it, so that'll run that locally. And then for their stack files, they'll leave that off because in the cloud they're usually using something like AWS's RDS, for example, and not running their own MySQL. So yeah, but you're probably already doing that, and I know you've already got your own workflows. So I'm mostly talking about other people that might be listening and curious about Compose versus Swarm. All right, so you learned a little bit about that. And also, yes, in case you're curious, I have an offline Ask Me Anything over on GitHub that I linked to a while ago. And that is a list of commonly asked questions that others ask of me on the internet. And then I label them and answer them and leave them open so that other people can quickly find them in case you're curious about common questions. And the nice thing is now there's 38 questions in here and growing. So usually you can come into the labels, and if you want to only see security topics, for example, you can filter them out to just showing the security related items that we talk about. Particularly my most popular one here on security is what security concerns should I have with Docker, and how should I go about locking it down? It's a really great question. I get it a lot. So people will ask me sort of, how do I approach security? And I try to give a relatively short answer to the first things you need to concern yourself with, and then as you get more mature in your security stance, what things you need to worry about later as you get more advanced. Because a lot of times I think people jump to the advanced stuff way too early. And it's one of those things like, obviously, it's the analogy I might say is, if you haven't even locked your front door in your house, then why are you bothering to, like secure things in a locked vault in your bedroom or something? Like you've got to have a security stance that makes sense. You would want to do the easy things first, and then as you get more advanced, do the harder things that are more complex. And so I try to answer that question with that attitude in mind, is that there's a lot of easy things to do that you can do right up front. And I will just put that in chat in case you're curious. So that's Ask Me Anything issue 17. And really, the step one is put your stuff in containers. Like literally putting stuff into containers adds a whole additional layer of security that you did not get before containers that will really help protect your application from doing other things that might be bad on the system in case in case someone hacks your database or hacks your web app and they're stuck in that web app container. There's a lot of things they can't do once it's put in a container versus if it was just running on the host without a container. So anyway, let's see what else. The last thing I'm going to share, in case we don't have any more questions, is in case you're not aware around multi-stage builds. It's something that I've been focusing a little more attention on again lately. For my new courses, I want to add more and more multi-stage stuff. So multi-stage came out a year ago, and it allows you to make one Docker file that essentially acts like mini Docker files in succession to end up with allowing you to have small images for production, but fancier images for development. Like maybe with all your dev tools in them, and then for production, you only have the things you need for production. And you can do all that in a single file. So I wanted to share, one of the Docker engineers actually it's now actually over a year old, but it's still a pretty good example of some ways you can use multi-stage builds in your Docker files in case you're not using them for building out sort of, like I just said, the advanced stuff for development or your continuous integration where you're doing testing, and then to have images that are built for simple uses in production where they don't have all that extra stuff in them. So you might want to check that out to make sure if there's any other ways you can use multi-stage, that you have all the ideas around how that might be used from the people that actually made the feature. So pretty cool thing. And I was reminded of that lately because in case you didn't know and you're not able to go to DockerCon, you can go to DockerCon's, let's see, how do I get to these videos? I think, is it videos? No, that's not it. Hold on, let me see if I can find this. So from DockerCon this year, the US 2018, oh, here we go. There's the URL. So you can watch a majority of the DockerCon sessions for free. And I'll put that URL in the live chat. And on here, I was catching up with some videos from June when I went to DockerCon, but I didn't get to see every session. And one of them I was watching was about advanced Docker files, and it led me to that blog post. So I thought I would share that, let you all know that there's still some really good stuff on the DockerCon video website. It's just not always easy to find that website when they're sort of hiding it behind other layers of the website. So do check out that link. I'm sure there's something there that we can all learn because there's hundreds, there's at least 100 videos. I don't know how many there are, but they had over 100 sessions at DockerCon, and I'm pretty sure they recorded most of them. So hopefully you found something useful today. Again, thanks for coming, and check out Hacktoberfest. Check out my stuff on brettfisher.com.